In this second video, we're going to continue looking at the cognitive explanations for offender behaviour. Now, if you've not done so already, what I'd recommend you do is make sure that you've finished off all of the information on the cognitive explanation of the level of moral reasoning and Kohlberg's theory, and then look at this one as the next one that you kind of come to afterwards. But again, hopefully this video is useful in supporting you making notes both on the explanation of cognitive distortions and the specific types. Notice that we need to cover hostile attribution bias and minimalisation as they're named aspects of the spec, and we'll also look at evaluation that you can provide for this particular question. Okay, so what do we mean by cognitive distortion? Well, anything that's distorted means that it's become unclear or different to its original form. Now, when we think about what a cognition is, then we're talking about thinking processes here. And this is where we might start to get errors and issues with the thought processes of people, which would often categorise and look at in terms of faulty thinking, such as things like irrational thinking. So at this point, have a pause of the video, have a think about what type of these thought problems might individuals with criminal behaviour have. Think about maybe some of the things that might trigger the crime, and then think about some of the things that might exist that might help justify criminal behaviour. Okay, so potentially one of the things you might have come up with is about how individuals end up engaging in violent crime, and the reason for that being the processing of potential threats within their environment. And that's precisely what hostile attribution is all about. We'd consider an attribution to be the reason that we give for a particular action. So an example of an attribution for somebody smiling at us might be that I will attribute the behaviour of that person. The reason for that is because they think they're being friendly. Now, when it comes to individuals who might engage in aggressive and violent behaviour, then this theory is suggesting that they're looking at a lot more of the information that's being given out by other people as potentially confrontational and aggressive. And these could be things like verbal cues and things that people are saying to them, or it could be more subtle things such as body language and the way that people might be standing or looking at them. Now, the link here between just individuals having a hostile attribution bias and individuals engaging in criminal activities is the fact that as a result of seeing this increase in potential threat, individuals then engage in irrational responses, quite often highly violent, and therefore these type of incidents will lead to individuals becoming prosecuted with certain crimes such as assault. Okay, so let's look at some of the evidence that you can present. As I say, you're not going to get a 16 marker just about cognitive distortions, but as part of shorter essays, you may well be asked to describe and evaluate, and equally, you absolutely could get a 16 marker where you're being asked to describe and evaluate cognitive explanations, where you'd be expected to bring in a range of different theories and analysis. So the evidence we'll look at here is the Schoenberg and Justy research. Now, they presented different offenders with emotionally ambiguous facial expressions. So ones where they had made sure that there was no clear emotion being presented by the person in the photograph. They then did the same process with a matched control group. So individuals who weren't violent offenders essentially was the criteria to be part of the control group here. And the individuals who had been charged with violent offences were much more likely to look at the images and perceive the emotions as being angry and or hostile. So we've got some really nice clear evidence here in a lab-based study where individuals are looking at the same photographs as other people but coming to those different conclusions. Most critically, those sort of conclusions based around individuals having a threat of violence. Okay, so we'll move on to the second cognitive distortion you need to understand, and we're going to look and hopefully explain out what minimalisation means. So if you think about minimalisation and that word, then if we minimalise something, we make it less. And this is about the more justification side of criminal activity. And once a crime has either been planned or even committed, the way in which individuals process information about that criminal activity. Now, specifically in minimalisation, what's happening here is that individuals are either in complete denial about the fact that they have done wrong, or that seriousness of what potential harm they've caused is being downplayed and being reduced, so it makes them able to process it more successfully. Now, Bandura used a lovely phrase here and referred to this as a euphemistic label. So something that might be a good example of this is individuals who would engage in theft and steal may well kind of downplay it or justify that to say that, well, this is just essential to support my family. So we're starting to see that minimalisation of the impact on the victims through the justification process. So as I mentioned there, the reason for this and the reason why it will not just cause individuals to feel more secure in completing one crime, but explain why individuals go on and re-offend and complete crimes over a multiple number of occasions, is because of that management of guilt. It reduces the negative consequences psychologically of crime, and therefore means individuals feel much more psychologically able to continue engaging with that activity. Okay, so that last bullet point I'm not going to read to you, but that basically is saying that, isn't it? Okay, again, we'll look at research evidence and make sure that you're happy here with how to show this could be supported. And there's a couple of studies we can use here. You'll notice that the common element of both of these studies is they relate to sexual crime, and that is actually something where minimalisation plays an important part. So there's no accident that we're suddenly looking at crime of a sexual nature here. Individuals who do engage in those sexual criminal activities are much more likely to have built up layers of these cognitive processes that has allowed them to feel like their actions are okay. So the Barbary research looked at rapists, and they conducted a series of interviews where they asked them about their crime and they asked them about how they felt about the sentencing that they'd received, and 54% of that group denied that they'd completed a crime. So they were, again, minimalising their criminal activity and believed that they hadn't completed it and conducted a crime, despite the fact that they'd been tried, sentenced and found guilty. Pollock and Hashmole looked at child molesters, and they looked at, again, the way that they described their crime and the way that they had processed information about the activity they'd engaged with. They found that 35% of those individuals argued that the crime they'd committed was non-sexual, and they used terms such as just being affectionate. So again, failing to acknowledge the serious nature of what they'd done, trying to give it a description which they felt more secure with. 36% of individuals stated that the children had consented, which we know is a non-issue, but they still use that as part of, again, their layer of support. So what I'd like you to do with these ones is just to practice out your evaluation process. Frame them in that peel structure. How would you signpost and introduce evaluation points like this? Remember, you are doing a couple of things here. One, you're evaluating minimalisation as a specific cognitive distortion, but this is also under this big banner of cognitive explanation. So just be cautious and think about and consider what the focus of the question would be here. And that should come through your point. It should make sure that your explain's there. So when you explain it, you should be referring back to minimalisation, and within your link, bringing it back to those cognitive elements. So you're showing, you're acknowledging this is a cognitive explanation. Beyond research evidence, we can also look at how this research can be applied in order to improve the way in which individuals are rehabilitated for their crimes. So when we look at the rehabilitation of sex offenders, the most dominant form of therapy that's used is CBT. And in this particular form of CBT, it is about targeting that faulty thinking of minimalisation, trying to challenge that thought and trying to give people more effective ways of processing that information. And in this sense, the more effective way is taking greater ownership over that behaviour so they can properly process that and come to a conclusion that makes them less likely to reoffend. So there's a range of studies here which show that reducing this process of denial and minimalisation has this knock-on effect of reducing risk of offending. I've just popped down an example of that in the Heller et al. Research, and they found that there was a 44% reduction in the arrests for a high-risk group that had experienced these CBT sessions compared to a group that hadn't. So that shows us that when individuals are given an opportunity to process these types of thoughts with a therapist, they're less likely to go on and offend, because we're tackling the way in which they are looking at and processing criminal activity. What I'd recommend you develop your notes with, though, with the Heller et al. Research is additional evaluation points there, and consider what problems there might be with that study. If we think about what the nature of individuals who would have continued to complete CBT in that session, so i.e. those that would have signed up in the first place and wouldn't have been put off by it, and those that would have continued to complete the study to be included in the results, then we may well have an important personality characteristic there that could explain the differing levels of arrests. You might well end up with a more positive group attending the CBT sessions and potentially slightly higher functioning compared to those that chose not to, that were still asked to for the study. And therefore this might not be a fair comparison here between the individuals who were involved in the CBT group and the individuals who weren't. Another issue with the minimalisation theory is that although it helps us be able to describe what's going on with the mental processes of criminals, it doesn't necessarily explain why it happens. Not everybody goes through these minimalisation processes, and therefore it doesn't necessarily help us fully understand why some individuals are more vulnerable to experiencing and processing information in this minimalistic way and some individuals aren't. And because we can't really appreciate what's led to that through this particular theory, it doesn't necessarily support us being able to be better at identifying it, and therefore it's a pretty reactive theory. We can kind of work out maybe what's going on with people who already have completed a crime, but we can't preempt that, and we can't work out what factors are contributing to individuals developing the faulty thinking in the first place. Okay, so what I've attached to this assignment is a range of different explanations and description of behaviours and scenarios. That's what I wanted to say. So a range of different scenarios that allude to either one of the four different cognitive explanations. So either Kohlberg, cognitive distortions in general, and just broadly faulty, biased or irrational thinking. Minimalisation, where the individual is downplaying the significance of the event. And hostile attribution bias, where individuals are perceiving normal information as threatening. So have a look through the scenarios, so I've attached it to the assignment, and decide which one is which, and that will kind of bring an end to this part of the lesson.